Good evening, everybody. I'm just going to say a few words about Arthur. When he finished his study, he got a job in the Smithsonian Institute. And within 1 year, he was invited to become an advisor to American Samoa, which, of course, is in the Pacific. He went there and spent time there, but unfortunately, he couldn't stay there because the funding wasn't available. So he went back to the Smithsonian Institute. And there he was studying many things, including coral reefs. It's one of his great interests. In 1974, he again was invited to go to American Samoa and the Pacific. And this time, he was able to take the opportunity. And he moved to New Caledonia, and he became the regional ecological advisor to 22 island countries and territories in the Pacific, serving the South Pacific Commission. And during this time, he advised governments and did many other things in the social area as well. He was there for 11 years before finally he left and went to France and then Nairobi. First of all, working with the United Nations Environmental Programme, and then finally joining to work full-time with the United Nations Environmental Programme. Now, the late 80s, early 90s was a very exciting time for everybody, of course, exciting time, leading to the Earth Summit, of course, in 1992 in Rio. And the preparations for that, he was very much involved in. And here in Shetland, in about 1994, we actually did some work of trying to learn how to, first of all, learn about, and then how to put into practice Agenda 21, which was the sort of action plan from the Earth Summit. It was a sort of global action plan. And what I was very amazed to learn was that Arthur actually did the final drafting for Chapter 17 of Agenda 21. And it was on oceans, coastal areas and islands, because of course by this time he really was an expert in that area and really has done a tremendous amount of work on this. And I see Mary Lisk here in the audience, and we were certainly working on Agenda 21 back in 94, 95, trying to see what it looked like over here in Shetland. And he's continued to work on islands and oceans, and after Agenda 21, he created some ways of working out whether it was working or not, and he joined the UN system, system-wide Earthwatch, as it was called at that time. So, you know, you make a decision and you make lines of action at a world conference, but you have to then see, are there any indicators to show, is it working or not? So again, he's been doing that on behalf of the planet, basically. So he's certainly got the big picture, and again, focusing on oceans, coastal areas, and islands. So you could say he's got islands in his DNA, which I think is very true. Finally, most recently, he got brought out of retirement, and he's got the New Shape Prize for the Global Challenges Foundation, which is an organization that looks at global challenges. And this was for proposals for global governance and the emergence of global institutions for the 21st century, which, of course, hopefully will enable us eventually to work together to put these things into practice. So, and that's just a tiny little bit of it. Please forgive me for being long, but all I can say is please give a warm welcome.
Well, thank you all for coming. I hope I can share with you both, might say, some bad news and some better news. There are always things to worry about with what's happening with the global environment and the changes that are affecting us in this century. And often these are particularly sensitive and delicate on small islands like yours. And so I will share both some of the global issues and also some of the specific aspects of those that are of concern to islands like the Shetlands. When you're living on islands, you're really learning to live within limits. And when you're on small islands, I mean, you're not quite as small as this one here, where I used to work. But, you know, where do you throw your trash when you're on an island like that? You know, the limits are extremely close. And so even though you scale up a bit, relatively speaking, that makes the Shetlands look quite large, like mini continents. This is actually Caribou Key on the Belize Barrier Reef in the Caribbean, where we had a marine station and we're doing work. But this really shows that when you scale down to islands, you're facing special challenges, and things that might not be a big problem in larger countries can become quite important when you break it down to the island level. I lived in New Caledonia for 11 years, and you can see it looks a lot like Old Caledonia, which is why Captain Cook gave it the name when he sailed by it, when he was doing his explorations in the Pacific. And so, even there, I've seen many of the things that are comparable to what you experience in Scotland. And of course, these challenges we're facing in this century, they're due to the enormous transformation that has happened in our world over the last several decades. The population of the planet has tripled in my lifetime. So we've become an invasive species. We're pushing planetary limits. We are going beyond what the planet can support in many ways. So this is not only at the level of islands, at the level of the planet itself. The planet itself is, might say, an island in space. And those limits are now becoming apparent because we cannot push beyond them. We can't simply expand the planet. Some people dream of going to live on Mars, but if you ever see Mars, it's not a very desirable place to live, and there's no return ticket. So I think we do better to try to live on the planet we're living on at the present time. But we're still trying to manage this planet with institutions from the 19th and 20th centuries. And the planet now is telling us that we're hitting those limits. The environmental problems that we see today, I'll reveal just a couple of them, is where the planet is warning us that we've gone too far and we need to bring some balance back to our material civilization. The international governing body of the Baha'i Faith described this as, "It is evident that the current defective world order has failed to protect the environment from ruinous damage. And the deepening environmental crisis is driven by a system that condones the pillage of natural resources to satisfy an insatiable thirst for more." Now, ruin and pillage are pretty strong language. You think of hordes sweeping out of the east and burning villages and creating havoc everywhere. So, and really, in a sense, what we're doing to the planet now, and that's why we have a climate emergency declared in Scotland. People are suddenly waking up to the fact that this is something we have to respond to. We can't wait for business as usual to solve this over coming generations. And the son of the founder of the Baha'i Faith said at the university, I said at Stanford University, all the way back in 1912, "The elements and lower organisms are synchronized in the great plan of life. Shall man, infinitely above them in degree, be antagonistic and a destroyer of that perfection?" And we inherited this beautiful planet with so many species and ecosystems and rich resources everywhere, and we've been rapidly destroying them all over the place. 38% of all the arable cropland of the planet has been degraded since World War II. That's an area equivalent to China and India combined. So where will we get our food from if we continue to erode and degrade this land through erosion, through overuse of the soil, destroying its organic matter, and so on? We're not aware of how much we're facing these limits today. Climate change, of course, is one of the things that is most alarming. And we're following the red curve, and the planet will have temperatures like this by 2081, up in the 5, 6, 7 degrees of warming if those go up. And of course, we know from recent studies that the warming is going up faster in the Arctic. So you could experience more warming here than further south. Of course, you might like a little more warming. It may be that would be, sometimes it might seem like a desirable thing, but it might bring with it more storms, or if it shuts down the Gulf Stream, you might actually get cooling here if you lose the benefit of the warmth coming up. So we can't predict the future for the moment, but you need to be ready for bigger changes than it's not the stability we've been used to for the last 10,000 years. And of course, it's not going to be easy to stop. And this is, I think, particularly of concern to you here, where the oil industry is an important part of the economy. The scientists say that the accepted limit for global warming without significant damage is probably about 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're already at 1 degree, and we're heading up very quickly, so within 5, 10 years, we could easily overshoot that amount. And the scientists can say, from the physics of carbon dioxide and the greenhouse effect how much more carbon we can put in the atmosphere and still knock over that level of warming. And it's approximately 565 gigatons of carbon, which we may reach within a decade or two. So how much carbon is there in the oil wells already pumping off your shores, in the coal mines already open, in the gas fields already, not counting fracking, not counting tar sands and other sources? 2,795 gigatons. That's more than 5 times the capacity of the atmosphere to stay within an appropriate limit. So if we want to avoid catastrophic climate change, we have to leave 80% of the existing reserves in the ground. Can you imagine saying that, not only to your offshore industry here, but to Saudi Arabia or Russia or Shell or Total, and yet the scientists say we've got to make the change within 10 to 12 years, turn the corner already, and stop using fossil fuels by 2050. So it's like slamming on the brakes of a giant tanker and saying, turn the corner and go another direction. It's not going to be easy, and yet the science says if we overshoot that, we're heading for catastrophe. Of course, there's a particular challenge for islands. Sea level rise is estimated now, I keep changing my figures, but the last I read, 1.2 meters to 2 meters by 2100. That's only the beginning. It will keep on going. And if there's some increasing melting in the Antarctic, it could be up to 5 or 6 meters. Now, you still have some high places to crawl up to, but it will certainly have impact on coastal resources, on port facilities, and so on, even here. And of course, you also have other problems, your dependency on fossil fuels. If suddenly there was no more petrol or diesel available tomorrow, how would the island function? You couldn't use cars anymore. The ferries and so on, going back and forth wouldn't be functioning. This is fundamental things about your way of life are linked to this technology that we're now being told is dangerous to our future. So thinking about how to make the change and how to go forward and how to find alternatives for those who make the living industry is all part of the challenge that we're facing. So there's problems within your transport on the island, transport to and from the islands, and you really have to say, how dependent are you on offshore resources for your survival? If things were cut off, if there were a catastrophe somewhere, could you find your way through in some way? How can are you resilient or are you particularly vulnerable? Which is one of the big questions that islands need to ask for themselves, particularly when you depend on a boom and bust economy. You had the herring boom, you've had the oil boom. I don't know what the next boom might be, but there may be busts in between. You need to plan for that and be sure that you're ready to ride it out when those things happen. If you live in an island like that, you might be more worried about sea level rise. That's Kaingal Atoll. There's a big tree in the middle of the one village on the island with shedding wide branches, and they call it the typhoon tree. In a typhoon, everybody climbs up in the tree because the waves wash across the island. And of course, they build their houses on stilts so that hopefully the house won't wash away. But inevitably, they're extremely vulnerable. And if the sea level rises, they'll go underwater. They'll lose their national territory. So what would it take to meet the 1.5 degree target? The scientists say, first, stop using fossil fuels, or else go to carbon capture and storage, which you use it, but to capture the carbon dioxide and put it back in the ground. That could be an asset for you in the future because the best place to store carbon is oil wells. So it may be that one part of your future would be in somehow capturing carbon and putting it down the wells and using that as a resource for the future. Travel light, much less travel, because travel is often done with fossil fuels, and therefore changing your travel patterns, doing as little as possible, going to other forms of travel, electric vehicles and things like that might be help. Rebuilding everything. So many of our buildings weren't designed to be climate neutral, and therefore changing the windows, insulating, building new buildings to high energy standards and so on. All of that is part of the challenge of rebuilding society around the world to not use so much energy as we wasted in the past. And we have to change the industries themselves. We build mostly today with cement and steel. They're two carbon-intensive, energy-intensive materials to produce. So can we replace them with other materials? They're now building skyscrapers 30 stories tall out of laminated wood. So there may be other, I can't suggest that for here, your forests are not very significant at the moment, so I can't suggest local wood as a substitute, but you need to at least say, what are the options and the alternatives as you go ahead? And of course, that means rethinking how we manage forests, our farms, our food supply, going perhaps to a plant-based diet, because the methane from sheep and cows is an important greenhouse gas and therefore part of the problem. And then any remaining emissions will need to be balanced by removing carbon from the atmosphere. But we don't know how to do it. There's known cost-effective technology to extract CO2. Plants can do it, trees can do it, but we haven't developed industrial processes able to do that effectively, which means ultimately we have to change ourselves, reducing our energy demand to the level of what the planet can support. So resolving climate change means changing the values, the attitudes, and the skills that give rise to just and sustainable patterns of human interaction with the environment. We need to forge a coherent ethic for the resolution of the climate change crisis, to progress beyond a world community driven by a largely economic and utilitarian calculus to one of shared responsibility for the prosperity of all nations. We're all in this together. The whole planet faces this problem. You cannot suddenly say, we're going to Brexit from the atmosphere and build walls around our country and keep our own climate the way it was. It doesn't work that way, even though some politicians might wish they could do that. And we've been working on these issues for a long time. Our Environment Forum held 4 events at the Climate Change Conference in Paris on how to hold governments accountable, on educating populations to be more climate sensitive, and building resilience in small communities like island communities. And we used Vanuatu in the South Pacific as an example of resilience at a small island scale. The interesting thing from an island perspective, last year in the climate negotiating process of the convention, Fiji chaired the process. And they said in the islands of the Pacific, when there's a serious problem, they sit in a circle and tell positive stories to encourage each other to be more ambitious. They don't criticize, they're not negative, they share positive stories, and so they said, let's do it with the diplomats. So they organized a series of Talanoa dialogues alongside the negotiations and sat 30 diplomats around with 5 other experts from the international organizations or the civil society, to share positive stories and to turn the direction of the negotiations. I took part as one of the experts in those negotiations, along with another Baha'i colleague in our Environment Forum. So the islands are also influencing how things are being done at the global level. Biodiversity loss is another challenge we're facing. And there's just recently, a couple of months ago, a new report from the United Nations, the Global Biodiversity Assessment. For the first time, they looked at the planetary level. And they said the extinction rate is now 1,000 times the pre-industrial natural rate. This is the 6th global extinction, like the one where the asteroid killed the dinosaurs 60 million years ago. Well, now it's human beings who are killing the species all across the planet. If we have 2 degrees of global warming, we'll lose 20% of all the species on the planet. If we go to 4 degrees, we'll lose half all the species on the planet. Imagine if nature was cockroaches and rats and house sparrows and dandelions, those few things that survive all our attempts to exterminate them, and all the rest of nature had vanished. In Europe, they've been studying insects in Germany and the nature reserves, and they suddenly realized we've lost 80% of the insect biomass in the last 30 years. It used to be you would drive and get all these things splattered on your windscreen. It doesn't happen anymore. They're gone. And of course, when the insects go, the insectivorous birds can't get food, and they're going as well. They just said in France, most of the birds are disappearing that fed on insects. So we're seeing a set of dominoes falling as we destroy major components of biodiversity. And at the global level, we've lost 60% of all vertebrates as well. And they warned 1 million species are now threatened with extinction. So the founder of the Baha'i Faith said over 100 years ago, the country is the world of the soul. The city is the world of bodies. And we need nature for more than just utilitarian purposes. It's also part of our connection. I think you're all sensitive here to the beauty of the Shetland Islands and how important nature is as part of that beauty. And this is part of what we have to respect as we go ahead in the future. This is what took me into coral reef research. I wanted to understand, how does nature do it to create unity and diversity? All the different species working together, building complex systems, supporting each other, as you often do on islands. And I realized that coral reefs are like cities, that they build their own structures, their own environment. The entire reef is built from the skeletons of plants and animals. And so you might also say that, well, cities are like coral reefs. We build up in the same way. Apartment buildings, you have balconies, people to hang out, like the corals are hanging out at their corals. So there's a lot that we can learn from reefs about how to build human societies. For example, they're very efficient at capturing solar energy. All those shapes and forms are to capture, just like the leaves on a tree, capturing the energy from the sun. And then they're very efficient at using the energy within the system. They have many trophic levels, and so the energy is passed on from one to another. There's very little waste of energy. It is all useful to drive the complex system. There's very little waste. Because they live in a resource-poor environment, those beautiful tropical waters are not like your waters offshore here. They're so because there's no plankton, that they're biological deserts. And yet the reefs concentrate what they have and recycle everything within the system to maintain their rich systems in spite of the resource-poor environment. And they can do it because they're so complex. Many different kinds of species. You have 400 kinds of fish and 100 kinds of corals and 4,000 kinds of crustaceans and other small animals. And all together, each one playing some role, often working together with each other to build the richness of the reef. And they maximize the total productivity. In our economy, we say, what is the most productive thing? We'll just do that. Everything else goes bankrupt or is made unemployed. But on the reef, everybody has a place. Every single animal adds something to the whole. Even the most handicapped, the most insignificant is going to do something more. We should do that on our human societies as well. Every human being can add to the wealth of the whole if we allow them to do so and give them the opportunity to do so. We need to rethink our systems to make certain that that happens in the future. I worked with many small villages. This was just one example with respect to biodiversity in Solomon Islands, where there was a fisheries management problem, and it was managed by the old pagan priests. And through the Baha'is, I was able to meet the priests, and they explained how they opened and closed the fisheries areas. So now you can collect here, and then they closed it again, and it was 4 to 5 years to allow the shellfish to grow to maturity. It was very sensitive biological management, and to help them transition from the old way of doing things to the new one with the fishermen to make certain they could continue to protect their resource as they went on into the future. Working with all ages, from the old to the young. And of course, there are other issues that you also face in and around islands. Water resources, clearly you have no problem with rainfall most of the time here, although if you suddenly had a drought, that might be a problem if there's not much water storage. But every time you use water, you may be polluting it in some way, and pollutant can accumulate in the groundwater and in different areas, and so you have to pay attention to the pollution issues. There's a big problem of fisheries management and overexploitation of fisheries. As you know, when the herring collapses and other things, changes take place. And so we need to do much more to manage the oceanic fisheries at an oceanic scale and make certain that they're not being plundered by fishing fleets from other countries and so on, taking much more than is sustainable. And this, we don't yet have the management mechanisms to do this properly at the global level. Of course, this is also increasing pressure on coastal ecosystems. Everybody's up about plastic pollution because we thought this was a one miracle material, but suddenly it's lasting forever and it's going everywhere and it's even coming down in our rain. You find it in every body of every fish. There's already microplastics. They're all the way through the food chain. So now slamming on the brakes is plastics, which is also a petrochemical and therefore comes from oil, is part of the challenge we're facing in the future. Not to mention noise pollution. You have orcas and things that are sensitive to noise. If you're doing oil exploration with explosives offshore and so on, this can affect their communications. Many different kinds of impacts that need to be managed in the marine environment as well. So those are a couple of environmental challenges. There are also the social challenges. We have increasing inequality in the world. I think recently they said that the 8 billionaires have as much wealth as 3.5 billion people, the poorer half of the planet. Now something's wrong. There's plenty of wealth for everybody to live properly on this planet. Why should it concentrate in fewer and fewer hands and leave many people without enough to educate their children and to provide for the basic needs of life? And of course, this then leads to people migrating, desperately looking for some better life somewhere else, which then produces xenophobia and the fracturing of communities and societies. There's a whole series of follow-on problems from this imbalance in the social imbalance in the world we need to address. Economically, we have a global system now where Industries move for labor is the cheapest. They can exploit the poor people in other places, leaving people unemployed where they came from. We have so many young people who are trained and want to work and can't find jobs because we want to raise productivity for the shareholders, and we're not worried about creating employment for everybody. So there's also imbalances in the economic system. And then, of course, the multinational corporations and the rich can put their money in tax-free havens and avoid taxation and not carry their share of the social needs for the world. So we have a whole series of challenges in the social and economic area to address. On islands, you have your own challenges. It's hard to keep young people on islands when the opportunities are greater elsewhere. They go off to study. It's not so easy to come home again. There's nothing to do in their specialization. You're more vulnerable because of your small size. Small size means that something could happen and push you over the edge. There are no economies of scale. Maintaining social services, medical specialties, and things like that are difficult to do in very small communities. So there are a whole series of challenges that you face. And therefore, islands are often sort of marginalized, pushed to the edge of things. People don't pay much attention to them. And on the other hand, if suddenly tourism becomes your major economic activity, you can easily be overwhelmed. It doesn't take many tourists when suddenly the roads are crowded and you have gridlock and they're building all along the shoreline and you have big challenges. You say, what do we do with these things? How do we bring this into balance with what the island can support? And of course, behind this economic problem is our economy driven by consumption. Much of the recent consumption is in fact based on borrowing. We're not creating enough wealth in the world to really pay for the things we're doing, and so our governments are borrowing more and more, our companies are borrowing more and more, consumers keep borrowing to keep buying the latest thing they're told to buy, and so we have this exploding bubble of debt around the world. It's increased about 50% since the 2008 financial crisis. In America, because they want to win the next election, so they're pumping money into the economy to say, we've got little employment now, everything is booming. And the other thing that's booming is the national debt, to the point where within a few years, the interest on the debt will be the largest element of government expenditure, bigger than military expenditure in America. China is going deeply into debt because they have to keep the economy growing to maintain political stability. And their companies are also heavily indebted. Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, warned before the Paris Climate Change Conference that the whole banking system could collapse because of climate change, because the banks have overlent to the fossil fuel industry. And if investors suddenly realize they're going to be stranded assets because that oil can't be sold, then there could be panic selling and the whole thing could come tumbling down. So there's these fragilities in the economy that we need to worry about. And of course, for us as individuals, we're being sold things all the time. There's aggressive marketing, planned obsolescence. They build cars that rust out in 2 or 3 years in your sold environment. You can change them again. We always have to get the latest iPhone. For our young people, every time you send a like on Facebook or you send a tweet, it triggers the same pleasure center of the brain as cocaine. And they know it. They use it to build addiction to the media so they can put more advertising, they can capture more of your data, and so on a whole circle there based on making us passive consumers of the products that make profits for the industries. Excuse me. Technical problem. I hope I stop. And of course, with the information technologies, this is happening at the global level. All over the world, every Chinese wants to have a car like the Americans. But there's just no way, with the limits of our planet, that we can go that far with the consumer society. So, but we can't simply say to the Middle East, go back to being Bedouins in the desert, go back to living in caves and hunting bears with clubs. That's not all. But we have to say, what do we propose as an alternative? Can we think of a better kind of society than the consumer society? And I think already many islands are going in that direction because social relationships, family, those things are much more important than having more things. You know the limits of living on an island, and those are the things that can grow forever. You can have more art, you can have more culture, more science, more knowledge. Many things can grow. It doesn't have to be the material side of society. So we need to offer better things so people overcome the habits of doing the same thing over again and sacrifice the superficial for things that are deeper and more fundamentally rewarding. It's not going to be easy. It's like a religious conversion in a sense. And you have to have both change ourselves as individuals and through social action change the society as well. And of course behind that is changing our values. Because our values determine whether what we really want to do is get rich quickly and have drive a Maserati or a Rolls Royce or a Bentley and impress people and inflate our ego, or whether we much prefer to be more altruistic and cooperative and get pleasure from being with each other and so on. So looking at our ethical principles, the spiritual frameworks from whatever faith tradition you may have, and this is what determines how we relate to each other. If you've been taught to like green people and be afraid of blue people, then you're going to have a fracture in your society between green and blue people. And on the other hand, if you've learned to love all of humanity and appreciate the wonderful diversity of cultures and languages and arts that we have around the world, then you're open to that diversity and want to learn from it, and we can build something together. Values are the social code of DNA. They encode the information through which we structure our society. So if we want to evolve to a more globalized society in all its diversity, we also need to have our values go to that level. And the most important of those values in a globalized world is really the oneness of humanity. Every person on the planet has been born into this world as a responsibility for the whole. They're a trust. And we're responsible for the welfare of all humanity in this globalized world. You can consume something that was resulted in say it has palm oil that came from the destruction of a tropical rainforest in Borneo or someplace like that. So your act of consumption is having an impact on nature and the poor people on the other side of the world today. So this is a collective trusteeship that is the moral foundation for our human rights and for environmental governance. And the welfare of each country and community can only be derived from the well-being of the whole planet. So we need new values for the economic system that should be aiming for a dynamic, just, and thriving social order, strongly altruistic and cooperative in nature, like many of the communities on islands, providing meaningful employment for all those people who want to work, who have skills to work, but aren't able to find it at the moment, and helping to eradicate poverty in the world. Because in a world where there's enough food for everybody, nobody should go hungry. If there's enough wealth for everybody, nobody should lack the necessities of life. But we need to restructure the system to address those needs. And of course, this means we also have to look at the levels of governance. We expect government to work at the national level. If a burglar breaks into your home, you want them to be arrested by the police, convicted in the court and sent off to prison. We don't have the same thing at the global level. If a big country wants to be a bully and invade another country, particularly if they have a veto in the Security Council, we can't do anything about it. Everything is voluntary at the global level. Imagine what it would be like if you decided, I'm going to go on red lights and stop on green lights for a change. That wouldn't work. We need to have certain common standards. But we don't yet have it for issues of peace and security and the global environment. And if we continue business as usual, we're going to end up in a catastrophe of one form or another. This is nothing new. Already in 1972, at the time of the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, there was a famous book called The Limits to Growth, a report to the Club of Rome. And they did a computer model. I knew the scientists involved. They were wonderful scientists. They did a computer model of the whole world system, population growth and resource use and pollution and all the different elements, and said, where is it going? And the graphs on the left, business as usual, 1900, 2000, 2100, 2 centuries. That everything would go fine until about 2020, 2030, and civilization would collapse. Now, our economists and politicians didn't want to hear that. They didn't like that. So there's nothing to this. We can find a technological fix for every problem. We can keep growing forever. And so people sort of forgot about it. So they repeated it again in 1992 for the Rio Earth Summit. And they had the same results. They said, in fact, if we decided to adopt Agenda 21 completely after that summit, we could achieve a stable, sustainable society. But they warned already then, if we waited 20 more years to start to change, to 2015, we couldn't avoid some crisis in mid-century and a much lower standard of living because they destroyed so many of the planet's resources in the meantime. So these were computer models. There were scenarios. This was just their estimate of what might happen. So where are we? Scientists went back recently to look at where we tracked along those predictions from 40 years ago. We're right on schedule. Slightly better on birth rates and death rates, but all the other features are going exactly as they predicted. There's nothing that says that they were wrong. We were heading for those planetary boundaries, and we see them very clearly now. The only thing that has changed is that any kind of gradual transition to sustainability is no longer a practical possibility. And this is, again, nothing new. The founder of the Baha'i Faith warned in the 19th century that the civilization so often vaunted by the learned exponents of arts and sciences will, if allowed to overleap the bounds of moderation, bring great evil upon men. He also said, be content with little and freed from all inordinate desire. I often think I should write that on my shopping list when I go down to the market. I think it would help me to say, do I really need this? Or perhaps I could live more simply without it. And he said, take from this world only the measure of your needs and forego that which exceedeth them. But this, again, this message from our spiritual leaders is nothing new. If you go to the Quran, Muhammad, but waste not by excess, for God loveth not the wasters. Or the Old Testament, see all my works, how lovely they are, how fine they are. All I have created, I created for you. Take care not to corrupt and destroy my universe, for if you destroy it, no one will come after you to put it right. So we can't say we haven't been warned. It's been around for a long time. We wanted to listen to those messages. And of course, the United Nations has come to similar conclusions. In the 2030 Agenda, which they adopted in 2015 by all the countries of the world, they said we need a fundamental transformation in society and the economy. The Sustainable Development Goals define a paradigm shift for people and the planet. Inclusive and people-centered, leaving no one behind. That's a beautiful statement of justice, not leaving anybody behind. The most marginalized, the people without papers, the handicapped, and so on. Everybody needs to be included as we move towards this better world. In the spirit of integrating the economic, social, and environmental dimensions, we can't stay in our silos with the economists doing their thing over here and the scientists thing over there and not talking to each other. We have to look at it all together in the spirit of solidarity, cooperation, and mutual accountability. And I won't go into the details of Sustainable Development Goals, but they said by 2030 we should have no poverty, no hunger, good health, quality education for everyone, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, good energy, decent work, good industry and infrastructure, removing the inequalities in the world, responsible consumption and production, better habitats, climate action, the sea and the land, peace and security. Everything is part of the package. And you have to do it all together. It's an integrated action plan. We can't just do a little bit here and there and forget other parts of it, because they're all part of the same global human system. So we need a transformation based on justice, against the backdrop of climate change, environmental degradation, and the crippling extremes of wealth and poverty. The transformation from a culture of unfettered consumerism to a culture of sustainability has gained momentum, and you can already see it in some places. It is a transformation that will require an earnest examination of our understanding of human nature and of the cultural frameworks driving institutions of government, business, and education and media around the world. Questions of what is natural and just will need to be critically re-examined. The issue of sustainable consumption and production will need to be considered in the broader context of an ailing social order, one characterized by competition, violence, conflict, and insecurity, of which it is a part. So with two Baha'i friends of mine a couple of years ago, we thought, what can we do to address these challenges at the global level? And there was this, you was mentioned in the introduction, there was this Swedish foundation founded by a rich businessman who wanted to solve the problems of the world, save us from catastrophes that could kill 10% of the world population. So he said, I'm putting up $5 million in prize money for the best ideas to save the planet. Inevitably, everybody said, well, that sounds interesting. And we thought we had some ideas to contribute, not that the money was so concerned, but we thought, so we prepared a little proposal. Then we heard 14,000 people had signed up to apply for the prize. And thought, we can't go anywhere with this. But because we'd gotten started, we said, well, we'll send it in anyway. But we said, well, forget about that. We got a contract with Cambridge University Press to write a book instead. So we're busy writing the book this last year, and suddenly last April, we get a little message, you're among the semifinalists for the prize you applied for. And suddenly it began looking a little more serious. And then beginning of May, they said, you're among 14 finalists for this prize. Please come to Stockholm at the end of the month. We're having a big conference, and you can present to the jury, and they will decide who is going to win the prize. So off we go to Stockholm, and it was a lovely conference. The opening was by the Director General of the United Nations in Geneva, and the Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs and leading scientists. It was clearly some kind of a serious operation. And the last night, they announced the winners. We took first place. So suddenly that spoiled my retirement. The last thing I needed at my age was to suddenly launch myself on solving the problems of the world, reforming the United Nations, and so on. But we need it, and so therefore I'm doing what we can to take it forward. The book is with the University Press now. They're in the final editing process. Should be out, I think, by January of next year. So hopefully it will help to show governments that there are possible ways forward. We can avoid some of the challenges and work around the issues that we are facing now and find something better for the future. I won't go into the details because in case you couldn't read them, but we think the General Assembly should become a legislative body that can pass laws about peace and security in the global environment. So we can say, what are the limits to greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, that we have to respect to say within those limits. We need to replace the Security Council and its veto by a better executive changer with a security force that can actually enforce its decisions and have courts that work at the global level. International Court of Justice is voluntary now. It's not very useful to have a voluntary court. You only say, well, I want to be judged only if it's going to make the right decision for me. Otherwise, I couldn't care less. But also adding a criminal court, a anti-corruption court, a human rights tribunal, other things we need to achieve a better balance at the global level. So sustainability is really an ethical concept. We're trustees or stewards of the planet's resources and biodiversity. We must ensure sustainability and equity of resource use into the distant future. This is far beyond the remaining oil in the North Sea. It's really saying, what is the long-term future for your islands? We need to consider the environmental consequences of all development activities. What and where you should do things, within what limits, and so on. We need to temper our actions with moderation and humility. Those are not words you hear very often in the mouths of politicians or economists. And I think a little more humility, a little more moderation would make a big difference in the world. We should value nature in more than economic terms and understand the natural world and its role in humanity's collective development, both material and spiritual. Sustainable environmental management must come to be seen not as a discretionary commitment mankind can weigh against other competing interests. I often hear, once we're rich, we'll worry about the environment. Right now, we're busy getting rich. But rather as a fundamental responsibility that must be shouldered, a prerequisite for spiritual development as well as the individual's physical survival. And that's the challenge that we face today. So what can islands do? I think be aware of your island's limits and learn to live within them. You can sort of see them there, and so just being conscious of that and keeping that in mind all the time. Think more systemically about how everything is interrelated. Oh, if you do this, this is going to change something over there, and it might have an impact on something here. You have to see the whole picture when you're trying to manage an island or other environment. Maintain or reinforce your sense of community, because you're all living on the island together. As you know too well, you probably know all each other and everything about you, and it can be an advantage or a liability from time to time. And the world is changing, so you need to keep ahead of those changes, innovating and building resilience in your communities for things that may come down the line. And don't wait for help outside. It's nice, but there's an awful lot you can do yourselves now, and I'm sure you have the capacities to do many things yourselves in your own community. At the individual level, you can re-examine your values. Are you sort of tempted by the consumer society? Are you attached to something? Maybe it was time to be a little more detached and go in some other direction. Educate yourselves to the issues. When you buy things, where do they come from? Who made them? Is it poor women in Bangladesh, working 14 hours a day in a sweatshop and so on? Or can you be more responsible in things you're getting? Change your way of thinking to be more integrated, systemic, and long-term. We often think just about tomorrow and not beyond that. Look outward with more solidarity And I hear you already have been helping people in Albania, and there's a sense of solidarity in islands that can sort of spread to other parts of the world and do your little part in helping address problems elsewhere. And live lightly on the earth, a light footstep, being content with little. For biodiversity, as a consumer, buy only what you need from sustainable production that doesn't threaten tropical rainforests or overfishing. Avoid pesticides and other chemicals, particularly on islands, because once you use it where it's going into your water, it's going into your coastal waters, it's going into the animals that are there, it's going into the birds. So you really have to be careful what chemicals you allow on your island and how they're used. Plastic, of course, contaminating the world, so could you ban plastics in your islands? Illegal to import plastics from islands? Find alternatives and phase them out. All these things might be possible, especially on islands. Cats, unfortunately for those who love cats, are a disaster for biodiversity. They love birds and kill millions and millions of birds. So at least put a bell on your cat, a collar and a bell, make it a little bit harder for it to catch birds and achieve a better balance. Organic gardening for your at home, vegetable garden and so on. I can't say that you should plant lots of trees on your island, but where there are people who grow trees, there's a lot they can do to rebuild forests and areas that are being destroyed. Stabilize your soils and maintain your vegetation cover. You only have so much. You may have cut some peat in some areas and damaged some of those resources. What can you do to ensure that that soil resource stays there for the long-term future on your islands? And protect your ponds, the streams, the watersheds from the drainage of chemicals, pollutants, fertilizers, sewage, particularly storm runoff can often be particularly damaging. As individuals, water is not a problem most of the time, but whenever you use it, you're somehow polluting it in some way, and therefore, where is it going and what is it doing? Energy, we've already talked about with respect to climate change and being more responsible in how you use energy for heating, cooling, cooking, lighting, and appliances. Transport, again, I've referred to rethinking your forms of transport. For food, many choices, fast food or organic, meat or vegetarian, local or fair trade, with pesticides, hormones, antibiotics, contamination of various sorts. There are lots of things you can do to rethink your diet and think, what can you do also in that area to live more responsibly? You often think about clothing. I know you're lucky to have wonderful quality of wool to make excellent sweaters and other wool items, but there are so many things where they come in synthetics now, and every time you wash a synthetic fabric, little bits break off and they go into the water and they get into the sea. They're even finding the particles of plastic now in the rain coming down because the dust has blown up there and contaminated the clouds and it's coming down again. So, but then maybe in a certain sense, buying one thing you can wear for 30 years, if it's synthetic, may be better than having to replace something every 4 or 5 years or whatever. I must admit that my socks from the millennium 2000 are beginning to wear out, but there's a lot one can do. And at my age, I can say, what's the latest style? Oh, it's 1960s. I've got some hanging in my closet. I can bring back in style. If you don't put on too much weight, these things are also possible. And of course, as consumers, we consider socially responsible manufacture, changing styles or keeping things until they wear out. In fact, I was at a school a couple of days ago, and the kids were saying, when something's broken, we throw it away. And can we do something about it? Well, I said, why don't you organize a fix-it club at your school? And those of you who are good at tinkering with things or know how computers work can take the broken thing, oh, this can be fixed this way, or this can be done that way, or this is how you can recycle it. And just in the school itself, they could already address that part of that problem. Of course, with housing, you can't always choose where you live, but where you can choose, is it as energy neutral as possible? Or can you improve it in some way to make it more energy neutral or even energy positive? And of course, for recreation, tourism, and entertainment, there are those things that are good for the environment and those things that are bad. What choices are you making? And of course, the aesthetic aspect. Beauty is important, nature is important, contact with nature is important, and therefore you need to include that as well when you're considering issues of sustainability. There was a wonderful research project looking at patients in hospitals. And patients who saw a tree out their window got better faster than patients that didn't see a tree out the window. And even if they put up a video screen of the same tree on the video screen, it didn't have the same effect as the real tree outside the window. So keep as much nature as you can. That's important for your well-being, mentally, physically, and in many other ways. So the pathway to sustainability will be one of empowerment, collaboration, and continual processes of questioning, learning, and action in all regions of the world. As the sweeping tides of consumerism, unfettered consumption, extreme poverty, and marginalization recede, they will reveal the human capacities for justice, reciprocity, and happiness. This is a few websites you can use if you want to go further on Environment Forum, on many of the things I've mentioned here. And thank you very much for attention and your patience, and I hope I've stimulated some discussion or questions or violent protests or whatever you feel is necessary in the circumstances. Thank you very much for coming this evening, and I'm open to any questions.
Well, that was some food for thought. There's a bit of chance here for questions, if anybody would like to answer questions. Robert's going to run with the mic for anybody out so we can hear what the questions are. Anybody comes to mind? Anything come to mind?
The first question is always the hardest. Oh, thank you. Yes, yes. Yes.
I'm trying to figure out how to put this properly, but we're speaking about all these things that can happen. You've been involved with the UN. What actual solid things are being planned in the process now that you know of?
At the United Nations? Yeah. Well, the United Nations sort of behind the scenes does many very important things. For instance, in the area of chemicals and chemical pollution, there are a whole series of international conventions that address trade in dangerous chemicals, that address the endocrine disruptors chemicals have been proven to affect our hormonal balance and bring them under control, that address mercury in the environment and how it should be controlled. And so, a lot of things have been done to try to protect everybody on the planet from things that are proven to be dangerous. WHO does a lot for health and epidemics and, the possibility of flu spreading around the world and so on. And in the UN Environment Program I've worked with them for many years addressing different sea areas and helping the countries around a sea area to control the pollution going into it. They're not always perfectly effective because the economic powers are very large, but in many ways, we've avoided some of the damage. We haven't yet turned the corner, unfortunately. The powers, the economic powers, in a sense, colonialism in the 19th century was sort of rape and pillage, the resources of the poor for the benefit of the imperial countries. Now it's the multinational corporations that are doing the equivalent rape and pillage of the planet, and there's no system of governance for multinational corporations. The United Nations has been kept out of it so that it won't interfere with business interests, and therefore it hasn't been able to do much in that area. We in fact propose a whole chapter on how to create a level playing field for business at the global level so you can use its innovative capacity for good and not for bad. I was actually a consultant to the World Economic Forum, the Davos meetings, looking at how to change their approach to environment. And what we found, surveying 30,000 businesses around the world, was that the most competitive companies and countries were also the most environmentally responsible. And they said they needed strong government regulation, fairly enforced, so that they could use their innovation to meet the needs of society. If there was no regulation, or you could pay under the table to avoid it, that was bad for everybody. So there is some responsible business, but they're trapped in a framework where they don't have the room to maneuver to do as much as they would like, and we need to help them. And hopefully the UN can move in that direction.
Somehow, though, there seems to be some optimism there. But what makes you think that the United Nations will actually be able to survive a policy like that when all the major governments and an awful lot of the smaller governments in South America, etc., are withdrawing from anything that threatens their own personal interests? Do you really believe that the United Nations can get enough power to unify all these disparate politicians?
Well, I would certainly say there's no hope with the politicians, I might hope that the system might be able to. In our book, we actually have a whole series of scenarios. The ideal, all the governments decide to do the right thing and they do it. Very unlikely. At the other extreme, after the Third World War, somebody finds a singed copy of our book and says, that's what we should have done. Now, in between the two, what kind of crises might push the governments to take another step forward? The European Union, after World War II, Monet and Schuman said, we've got to do something to rise above the warring European countries. Let's learn to cooperate. But they knew their governments wouldn't agree. They went over their head and said, we're going to create a coal and steel community. Because Germany has coal, France has steel. Only together can they rebuild all the damage done in Europe. And having proven that that worked and didn't destroy anything, then they could take another step with the Club of Rome, the Treaty of Rome, and the Treaty of Maastricht, the Treaty of Lisbon, and so on, step by step building some supranational governance. So maybe the governments will say, climate change is so threatening, let's agree just to establish binding limits for climate change and share them around the world. And having seen that that works, then maybe build some confidence to take steps further. Or it could be a major crisis. I mean, it took World War I to make the League of Nations, World War II, the United Nations. If some of the stupid politicals that we have now go to war, that may be something that after that we'll say we must do it, which we're saying at least we can put on the table what needs to be done to make it work. One way or another, sooner they will see this is the only way forward. We can't continue the anarchy that we have at the present time and the egos of our inflated politicians who are thinking about themselves more than they are about the good of all of humanity. And we need as people to push them in that direction. It's not the perfect answer, but we at least explored the options and saying it's not impossible. There are practical ways forward. We can get around the veto by a charter replacement conference if we need to, and to say that therefore we should start talking about it. And I think many middle countries would come along. We've already had discussions with some Latin American countries, not the one you referred to, but others, who are very interested. And I think once countries realize that in the globalized world, they've already lost their national sovereignty. They don't control the multinationals. They don't control the global economy. They're becoming victims of it in many ways. And the best way to maintain their national autonomy and their differences is by creating that framework of collaboration globally to ensure that the diversity of nations around the world can prosper and develop in the world of today. So we're trying to make it look reasonable and possible and then hope for the best as we go ahead. And after 50 years, I'm still an optimist.
Yes, but in short, your proposals would not give the United Nations the big stick with which to persuade people more forcibly to keep in line with your proposals.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you think of as a big stick. I mean, I don't think we should arm the United Nations with more nuclear weapons than any other country so we can blast the whole world to oblivion. But we do have proposals for staged disarmament to gradually reduce, with a certain level of trust, the armaments of all countries, while building up an international police force that would become more powerful than any nation's military and therefore able to enforce it. It might take 10 or 20 years to do it. It couldn't happen overnight, but that's part of the plan for finally giving the United Nations the equivalent of a national police force for those recalcitrants who want to break the law and do things damaging to other parts of the world.
Actually, I was thinking more, though, on the financial side of it, maybe massive embargoes against the worst offenders, even to the stage of being able to put restrictions on some of the major countries.
We have a whole chapter on that. One of my co-authors is a distinguished economist who was chief of the World Economic Forum, has worked for 10 years at the World Bank and the Indicators Program, I'm a representative in Moscow. He knows the system and a whole series of proposals to rebalance the financial system, to avoid the extremes, manipulation of that system by banks and private interests, and to allow it, in fact, to meet the needs of the world economy and prevent us from the kind of financial collapse we saw already in 2008 that could easily happen again. So it's part of our proposals, yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi there. I've got a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One is at a local level, because we're talking about islands here. I mean, we've been talking to the local authority here about climate change and how it might address it. And the response is that, you know, we're all aware of the issue, but we don't know what to do about it. It's no one's responsibility. So we don't know where to place this issue within the authority. Have you got any suggestions about how an island like Shetland could tackle an issue like that? And the other question is just a general one about how optimistic you are about your vision being implemented.
Well, with the first question, I think it can be addressed at several different levels. They talk about adaptation and mitigation. Mitigation is trying to reduce contributing to the problem. So to the extent that you can reduce the amount of carbon dioxide being produced by activities here, I mean, there may still be a little bit of peat burning, and that's destroying an ancient carbon stock. It may also mean how quickly can you move away from using fossil fuels, the various functions on the island, and move to alternative energy sources. All of that is helping to reduce your tiny contribution to the global problem. But everybody has to do something about it, and therefore do your share, maybe set an example for others, show it's possible. And on the adaptation side, it's really a question, what threats might be increased as a result of climate change? If on the one hand, the Gulf Stream shuts down, would this mean things getting colder? Maybe agriculture will become more difficult here. How would people survive if they can no longer keep so many sheep on the land, or the winters get to be too long, or so on? And some contingency planning, if they may have more severe storms, or higher storms, bigger waves, or things like that. Are there things that could be done to reinforce infrastructure or to respond to some of those potential crises? On the other hand, if along one of the scenarios there's, say, a financial collapse and trade ends around the world and things come to a halt at some point, how well could the Shetlands survive on their own? If transportation breaks down to the mainland and you have to live on your own resources, how long could you do so? How much food is there around? Who knows how to grow potatoes or whatever to muddle through and get out the other? So I think just thinking more creatively about those different dimensions. And how do you educate your children? They're going to have to live through this much more than any of us. And already giving them the values and the principles, and the need to work together on these things, the sense of community, all of those things are part of better resilience for the future. In respect to my optimism, as I mentioned, I think it's partly because of my Baha'i faith. I think the future for the planet as a globalized world, once we overcome this transition from separate sovereign nations arguing with each other and not looking at the common good, towards a unified world where we recognize our common humanity and want to preserve our diversity while also working together to build a better civilization. So I think in the medium or long term, it's going to be fantastic. It's the transition is the problem. We have to get rid of the obstacles in our way in order to build something new, and that might be painful. So I'm less optimistic. The longer I've been in this, the more I've seen the frustration of trying to make progress and not going far enough, and things get better and then they get worse again. And the present generation of world leaders is clearly not up to the task, and therefore, more and more concerned about what this means in the immediate future, maybe even the next 2, 3, 5 years. I think we need to be prepared for anything at this point.
Are you given confidence by we've recently seen kind of an upwelling of protests, school strikes and such like? Are you given more optimism by that there's a grassroots movement for change?
Definitely. In Geneva on the 15th of March, I was marching with the kids with a sign saying, "Old people support the youth," to encourage them. They're not alone in this. Some of us are also behind them and happy to see them, telling their parents to do something about this, even if they can't yet vote. Yes.
How much do you think it is contingent on America and possibly one or two other large countries like China and Russia getting behind this? And do you think they effectively have a veto, and say America could just scupper the whole things by themselves?
Well, within the present United Nations Charter, there are provisions for charter revision. In fact, there was a requirement for revision after 10 years. There should have been a conference in 1995 to update the charter in 1955, and that was blocked by the veto. And ever since, it's been on the agenda and always vetoed. So yes, and of course, they also included the veto in any attempt at charter revision, not only the Security Council. So they put a locking vote from the very beginning. So but that's why we say, if we can't revise the charter, we can replace it with something. If most countries say, we want to go forward, if a few countries want to hold behind, we'll ignore them for the moment, we'll build a new organization, give it better funding, make it bigger and stronger, and then propose a merger or a buyout, or maybe a hostile takeover. And when you look at, I think many governments, we've talked to some already, and even China likes to be ahead of things and might see that they would get enough to gain from this over Russia and America to come in and join the others. So it might just be a couple that stay behind, but then if you leave them holding an empty bag with nothing in it, finally maybe they can be convinced to join into it. But it shouldn't hold us back from taking steps forward. So we acknowledge the problem, and we think there still are ways of working around it, while hoping that maybe elections will change things somewhere along the line, and we won't see continuing obstacles.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there any possibility that creating a new Bretton Woods would help to reorganize the world economy so that we didn't have to dig everything up in order to make a profit from it?
Well, Bretton Woods was part of the creation of the UN system. They were planning it from 1942. That was the first step in the process. And Keynes wanted to create a single world currency to prevent this manipulation of currency by different countries. But the UK and America blocked that. They wanted to hold on to the pound sterling and the dollar, and therefore they had over second best creating the International Monetary Fund. Now, one of our experts worked for the Monetary Fund, knows it inside and out, and we have a whole chapter on how to reform the IMF to make it capable to actually manage the global economy and avoid the instabilities and imbalances we have at the present time. That's part of our proposals. So it wouldn't have to be a separate conference. One of the several, all of this has to change together, but it's clearly one part of the process is to reform the international system to bring it in line with the needs of the world that we have today.
I'm not sure if this is going to be a question really, but more of an observation. I recently had the chance to travel from Hull to Rotterdam and then by car down to Germany. I don't know if anyone's been to Rotterdam, the port of Rotterdam, but it's, I think, the third biggest in the world. It has something like 5 oil refineries, one of which I think has recently introduced a new plant to produce low sulfur diesel rather than high sulfur diesel, because what they're anticipating is, of course, an increase in usage of diesel. In other words, they're looking to more and more transport and whatever else, and plastics industries and so forth. So I feel very pessimistic when I see things like that. And I just can't quite imagine how that whole trading system, I'll go back to the roads, yes. The amount of heavy traffic yes. coming from Germany and yes. further east to Rotterdam is absolutely phenomenal. And I know they're talking about computerized driverless convoys of vehicles taking goods. The consumerism that's driving all this just does not seem to be getting any less at all. I mean, does that not have any bearing on your optimism? I mean, I'd love to share your optimism.
It's clear, as you saw on the graphs, business as usual is going to continue unless something brings it to a halt. Now, hitting these planetary boundaries including climate change, may well reach a point where there's a breakdown in the system. My own personal hope, you might say, is that there were a rapid financial collapse. If the bubble of debt bursts and it shuts down world trade because there are no currencies to trade in, that might shut down the fossil fuel system, trade in fossil fuels long enough to make the transition to something else. But it may take a shock like that to break the momentum. I say it's like a giant oil tanker. It's not easy to change the direction of an oil tanker, and there's that inertia in the economy. So something like the Titanic hitting an iceberg may be necessary in order to achieve that. But it's a reasonable possibility. I mean, when Mark Carney is saying the system could collapse overnight, clearly these are people who know how fragile it is. And so that's why, in a sense, my optimism is partly that I see these alternative ways forward that might, in fact, break the momentum enough to stop those things going forward and allow us to go in a new and more constructive direction. So I tell young people, don't bother tearing down the old system. What you need to do is be planning to put it in place. Get the skills, experiment with alternative models of economy and so on. Imagine what you were doing, and when the ice breaks, then you can move quickly to build a new and better system to take its place. And that's, I think, where my hope really is, that we're not going to see business as usual until we go over the cliff and it all collapses.
Thank you.
If I could perhaps change the subject to Europe.
Yes.
As you know, we are facing a little problem in Europe.
Yes.
We're facing basically the breakup of Europe. Britain is taking a lead in this. And I mean, this is going against everything you're talking about in terms of cooperation among nations. We're basically going in the opposite direction here. How can you see, or what do you see could happen to make Europe see sense and turn the corner again and try and move back towards more cooperation?
Well, I think the science is saying we're only going to survive if we cooperate. That if we ignore cooperation, we're going to wipe out biodiversity, we're going to have climate crises increasing all over the world, we're going to see all sorts of disintegration in the systems, we see fragmentation, every social problems emerging. And so therefore, every time we turn away from that movement towards cooperation, which is really the evolution of the next level of human civilization in the future, now that we no longer have physical boundaries between countries, when we go in the other direction, we're simply making more problems for ourselves. And that will ultimately, I think, in a sense, those are discrediting themselves. They're saying we can do it another way. They're making promises, often with no basis in fact. People believe them. So you try the alternative, and if you fail miserably, then you must say, well, we made a big mistake. We have to go back and work for cooperation again. So there's some people trying to avoid the worst. Others seem to be plunging into it to demonstrate this is not the way to go. Sorry for you, but that seems to be what's happening at the moment in your own country. But we will see where that leads. But if it does demonstrate how badly cooperation is really needed and how hard it is to function without that cooperation, that would be a lesson learned for the rest of the world, as well as for yourselves. Not pleasant, but this is the reality of human being and human behavior. We don't always do the right things the first time around. Well, let's hope the third time is the best. World War I, World War II, we already had two difficult times. Let's hope that the third time is the right one.
We have a lovely cups of coffee and tea.
Moderation in all things. We need to take care of the material side of life as well as the spiritual side of life. So
we do that, we thank Dr. Dahl for his talk. It's been brilliant.
thank you for coming. Thank you.